Welcome to the Elk Talk Podcast with Randy Newberg and Corey Jacobson. Presented by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
The goal is, what little you and I know about elk hunting, we share with people.
I've got an elk building, it's like 120 yards away. What do I do? First off, the thought would never cross my mind when an elk's being 120 yards away to call anybody on a cell phone.
All elk?
All the time? Only elk?
Only elk.
Well, it's us having conversations, so we usually go down some rabbit holes, but
If you hunt with Corey Jacobson, you will find the landscape is full of rabbit holes. We're just going to make this up as we go.
and you look at it like, oh, that's a target-rich environment. But if you're trying to single one out, a solo target there is much easier to go into than a big group.
We record everything, so there's no BSing, no lying, no faking it with us.
Did we hit the record
I
button?
thought I forgot to hit the record button. If you want to know something about elk hunting, this probably isn't the podcast to listen to. Should we give them a list of all the other podcasts where they might learn something? The Elk Talk Podcast is brought to you by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, ensuring the future of elk, other wildlife, their habitat, and our hunting heritage. To become a member, go to rmef.org.
The Elk Talk Podcast is also brought to you by Mountain Ops, making outdoor energy and performance nutrition to make you a stronger and healthier elk hunter. They have a full line of hunting-related supplements, including meal replacement shakes, multivitamins, pre-workout fuel, and post-workout recovery. And my favorite, their new performance protein bars that, by the way, are packed with 270 calories and 20 grams of protein, but contain less than 6 grams of sugar. Visit mountainops.com to learn more and to order, and be sure to use the promo code ELKTALK to save on your next order.
The podcast is also brought to you by Gerber. Go to gerbergear.com and learn about the knives, the Vital, the Big Game Vital, the Gator Premium, all the things that we use when we're out in the woods, and not just knives, but also some really cool multi-tools that they have.
And we have a promo code for Gerber as well. Just use the code ELKTALK to save 20% on your orders at gerbergear.com. And we are also brought to you by Rocky Mountain Hunting Calls. And Rocky Mountain Hunting Calls is the original designer and inventor of the pallet plate diaphragm that's completely changed the way elk calls are made and used. And to find out more and to order your elk calls, go to RockyMountainHuntingCalls.com or BuglingBull.com and use promo code ELKTALK, and you're going to save 15% on all of your elk calls and elk call accessories.
The Elk Talk Podcast is also brought to you by GoHunt.com. Go to GoHunt.com and sign up for the Insider. The Insider is changing how hunts and hunting information are found. No doubt about that. Use promo code ELKTALK, and when you sign up for the Insider, you're going to get $50 of store credit, mad money, in their gear shop.
Lastly, the University of Elk Hunting online course is a proud partner of the Elk Talk Podcast. And within the University of Elk Hunting online course, you're going to find nearly 60 chapters organized in 17 modules of elk hunting instruction aimed at making you a more successful elk hunter. From planning and e-scouting to calling strategies and packing, every imaginable elk hunting topic is included in the online course. And regardless of your previous elk hunting experience or success, I'm confident the University of Elk Hunting online course will make you a more confident, more successful elk hunter. Just visit elk101.com and use the promo code ELKTALK to save 20% when you sign up for a membership to the University of Elk Hunting online course.
And with that, Corey, we are ready to get into it.
Let's jump into it.
Hey, Corey, how you doing today?
Well, we're back into winter weather here, so spring got put on hold evidently. I woke up to 6 inches of snow this morning, and it's snowing all day.
Well, you probably deserve that. You know, our guest, John Barklow, he lives here in the banana belt of Montana. We haven't had any snow today. John, welcome. Appreciate you coming back.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate that. Yeah, we had, an inch or two of hail out here on Friday, and it lasted till about noon on Saturday. That was it.
Yeah. See, Corey, it's John and I. We just practice this clean living stuff, so we don't get that kind of weather you got there in central Idaho.
You get perfect equator-like weather, 400-inch bowls around every tree. I just don't know what we're doing wrong over here in Idaho.
Well, you'll get there. Give it time. But really, why it snowed? It knew you were out there trying to scoop up all those early dropping antlers, and it said, "No, we're going to put a bunch of snow over the top of these, so Corey and Tyler can't come here and get the easy, quick strike on everybody."
Yeah, there was nothing easy. The last week I went out with Isaac, we, the elk are so spread out this year, and they didn't even bachelor up, some of them. Some of them just stayed by themselves way up high, didn't even move down. So we're finding one elk by itself, and 3 miles later, another elk by itself, and they're going to be spread out.
Do you partake in that foolishness called the shed antler hunting?
No, I don't. And honestly, I never even heard of shed antler hunting until I moved to Montana.
Yeah, I hang them in trees if I do find one. I mean, this time of year, I'm glad that people are out doing it. That means when I go fishing, there's fewer people at the fishing spot. But so
I wish more people were fishing, because there's a lot of people with gas prices like they are. I thought this is the year. Nobody's going to be out there. Man, gas prices aren't slowing down horn hunters this year.
That's what I've heard from a couple really dedicated shed hunters that I know, is that there's definitely people out in the woods looking.
Really? Yeah. Well, the good news is you don't want to have to worry about me being out there. So if you're invested in Conoco or British Petroleum, I'm not going to help drive up your share price based on how much gas I'm buying to go shed hunting. But hey, John, thanks for being back on the podcast. You were one of our earlier first guests when we started this chaos. And
really?
You've always been so generous with not just us, but so many people sharing your knowledge of so many things. And since the last time, you've started your own little gig, I guess. Can we call it? What do you call Knowledge of Storms? Is it a teaching platform? Is it just storytelling? What do you got going there?
Yeah, I like to say Knowledge from Storms is a outdoor educational platform. Okay. It's not specific to hunting, although, I hunt a lot, so I definitely reference that often, and backcountry ski. But yeah, it's if you want to go out in the backcountry and live and thrive and do your respective discipline, then, I may have something to offer you.
May, huh? That's typical John Barklow, understated, modesty, I may. So for those who didn't catch you on our previous podcast or other podcasts, John, give them a little bit about your background, what makes you such an expert in this area, because you are.
Yeah, well, expert is kind of a loose term, but
we use that term to describe all kinds of people, and we never use it to describe ourselves. But.
Yeah, no, I think that's best. Don't use it. Don't ever use it to describe yourself. But anyways, yeah, I was in the military for 26 years, but a large portion of that, 20 of those years, was dedicated to teaching predominantly special operations troops how to kind of move around the mountains and kind of live and thrive in these, austere, unsupported environments. And then obviously with 9/11, there was a much sharper focus on taking that skill set to, Afghanistan. So think very, steep, rugged mountains and very remote. And I was able to not only develop teaching points and teaching curriculum and criteria, but we were also able to develop the clothing and the equipment that supported that as well. So clothing systems, backpacks, sleeping bags, things like that. So it was a really very unique, I think, learning experience for me, because it wasn't just me going out and doing something or my friends, but then it was conveying these ideas to people in multiple different ways, seeing how those people interpreted that, seeing how they then turned that into action, and then was able to critique that, then go back and figure out how to maybe teach it differently or maybe learn new skill sets. So it was this wonderful feedback loop of information that really, I think that's when I really started to learn for myself, when I started to teach others. And so, like I said, I did that for a while, retired. I am now the big game product manager at Sitka. So I was able to take some of that information, build out these clothing systems that, I think have helped people like Corey in that hunt we were describing earlier, not die for sure, and obviously be successful. And so then I realized that, and COVID kind of did this when I was working from home and had a little time, that I had to be nudged to go on social media. But I realized that I was being very selfish with my information, and that, like I said, I probably have things or perspectives or ideas or knowledge that people may find valuable, and I was being really selfish by not sharing that. And so I decided to start. I like to say that because it's my own platform and business, I reserve the right to quit at any time. And so that's kind of like gives me my out and makes me sleep better at night sometimes. But it's been really well received, and I'm having a blast. I'm learning a bunch. If I did a blooper reel just on social media alone, people would roll over laughing. But no, I'm really enjoying, relearning some lessons, teaching some people, seeing the feedback from people, and kind of looking at their successes through their eyes now. And it's been a really cool journey. I didn't actually expect when I started.
Well, we're all the better because of your willingness to share. So thanks for not being selfish. But I'm interested to see what list of questions Corey has, because Corey did everything to try to get himself killed up in Southeast Alaska, a place that John, those islands of the Pacific, in the northern Pacific, John has spent tons of time there and knows the equipment demands those conditions place. So I might just sit back and listen to this Q&A session of Corey explaining how he survived and John saying, "How did you survive?"
That's we definitely asked ourselves that, and it's still looking back. John said he watched the Alaska film again today, refreshed on it, and felt our pains every step of the way. And like you said, he's got firsthand experience in a lot of that country, and a lot of his, I think, experience and training came at the hands of Southeast Alaska's brutal terrain and weather. But yeah, I don't know where we would even start. First off, I guess, John, before we jump in too much farther, knowledge from storms, you mentioned social media and everything, but they can find more information at knowledgefromstorms.com. Is that the website?
Yeah, correct. I've got a website, knowledgefromstorms.com. I have a YouTube channel, and then on Instagram, it's just at @Barklow.
Very cool.
Yeah,
it's like Randy said, I've known you since you started at Sitka, which, how long has it been now? How long have you been at Sitka?
About 7.5 years now.
Yeah.
So it's been a little tenure. So yeah, maybe I can start the conversation, Corey, by making a statement to you just in general about that hunt. So
yeah.
that hunt and everything that went into that, from the time you were dropped off to the time you were picked up, quite frankly, let's back it up and even talk about the planning leading up to that, was a graduate level trip. That's not something that people do when they start, right? This is something that you have to work up to. And even with all your experience, everything that I could think of was thrown at you, from the remoteness to the weather to the terrain to animals being very sparsely located, to bears, to a partner that was sick and injured, so somewhat debilitated, to horrible weather. And then that's just the trip. Then you get what I estimate, having hunted Roosevelt elk, 1,000 to 1,200 pound animal on the ground that you then had to figure out how to extract from the field, even if you didn't want to. Law requires that. And I saw the gear you used. Oh, and by the way, you had a what I'll call not a survival situation, but a unplanned night out. I mean, literally, it was everything that we talk about, that my platform tries to prepare people for, all rolled up into one trip. And I don't know, it was like 6-7 days. And I'm not patting you on the back because I know you, but you guys crush that. And the reality is that sucks. It's hard. There's no perfect way to do it, but that you not only got there and got back and didn't lose anybody and didn't get hurt, although I'm sure it sounded like there were some tumbles and falls, but you were also successful in the ultimate goal of harvesting a Roosevelt elk with a bow, by the way, which I've hunted Roosevelts and I don't know anybody that's actually ever killed one with a bow. So kudos to you guys for actually doing it, pulling it off, and being as successful as you were all the way around.
No, I appreciate that. And as you were listing all of the obstacles that we had, like you said, just about everything that sucks about the outdoors can be experienced right there in one day. I mean, realistically, I've never been anywhere, you get elements of different things, whether it's heat, whether it's remoteness, whether it's steepness, but to put all of them together. And we were warned, before that's probably the hardest hunt in Alaska. And you think about Alaska, I think Alaska has the hardest hunts in North America for the most part. And then to take and make that specific hunt one of the most difficult ones, we were prepared, but I don't think you can ever be fully prepared for what it really is going to throw at you.
Well, that's where you really fall back on your bag of tricks, right? On your experience, the partnership. Like I said, we could talk about this for hours, but the partnership alone, that bond that you all had, that, Donnie's hurt, we need to rally, the weather's bad. Obviously, you're only going to kill one bull on that trip. I mean, you might have gone in with the expectation of 2, but it was probably pretty obvious early on you're going to kill one. So just the partnership alone, the navigation that you really didn't talk about until you got cliffed out. But I know what it's like navigating in that type of terrain with zero visibility, and you have, rain and vegetation. And, oh, by the way, you're probably thinking you're going to run into a bear at some point in time. Obviously, you saw at least one. There's so many aspects to that, I mean, really it takes a very experienced, or dare I say, professional type team of people to go and actually pull that off, outside of even the hunting and harvesting of the animal. There's so many layers to that hunt that, like I said, it started to give me flashbacks. I was sitting in my chair, kind of sweating and twitching, and tapping my foot and the whole thing.
Then a couple things, Randy mentioned video always flattens topography. You can never truly get a feel for how steep it really was. And there was one scene where we cliffed out and we could not go down any farther. I mean, I'm standing holding onto a tree, looking straight down the hill, going, if I take a step here, I don't know what's below if I'm to break loose. And, we're standing there on the hillside, and on the video, it just looks like, yeah, you're on a steep hill. I mean, you can get an idea that it's not flat, but you can't see how steep it is. But then John, our camera guy, to be able to continue telling the story with the camera in those conditions while he's packing, while he's doing all that, I mean, that adds a whole nother aspect to what he did on that hunt.
Yeah. Navigation. I've been talking about navigation the last couple weeks, and there's a couple more weeks to go. But I'd said that people don't get lost anymore with Onyx and all that, different mapping software. People don't get lost anymore. But the art of navigation is really kind of a dying art, right? And so this isn't a commentary about you guys, but it looked like you were maybe trying to, from what I could surmise, take a shortcut to get down to the lake, so a route you hadn't taken. But, when you start to look at a map with contour lines, and you have to have a little bit of understanding of the terrain. So you guys were at a disadvantage, that you start to realize, well, geez, if these are 50-foot contour lines and they start to stack together, like we've already got, I mean, the Roosevelts I've killed, the hindquarters without the hocks were like 85 pounds, right? Just a hindquarter. So you're like, how can you possibly get down something super steep? We haven't even gotten to the crampons yet. So you have to figure out, that navigation. And then the smartest thing you guys did, because most of the time, the hardest thing to do is turn around and go back up. Smartest thing you guys did is turn around and go back up.
Yeah.
Because that's when people really get into predicaments. Yeah.
And we dropped down another probably 60 feet past where I said, I don't know if we're going to make it any farther. And then we went down 60 more feet, and it got even worse. And I mean, it's so hard sitting there with 80 pounds on your pack, pouring rain, knowing you've already dropped, probably 600 feet in elevation, and looking back straight up that mountain going, we've got to climb back up out of here. You want to push as far as you can, but at the same time, you know that you've already pushed to the edge of safety. And on that, I was probably 20 yards down the hill with crampons on, and the crampons broke loose, and I started sliding on rain gear, and it was just wet grass and vegetation. And I bet I went 15 or 20 yards at a pretty high rate of speed before I was able to get my heels dug in and slow down and get stopped. But I mean, something like that is just, if you don't get stopped, 80 pounds on your back's pushing you so fast down that hill that, that's when I realized, okay, we can't take chances today. There's no, hey, let's go another 10 yards farther. We've got to be smart about this.
Well, your margin of error gets very slim, right? So what you experience is what I call the Gore-Tex bullet, because when you're wearing rain gear and you hit that, slick grass or snow, like you accelerate a lot quicker than you think. And I'm guessing somebody clued you into bringing crampons, but could you imagine if you didn't have crampons and or trekking poles? You couldn't have even moved around that terrain.
No,
right?
I didn't wear them the first day.
Dangerous.
Yeah, it was dry the first day. We weren't packing weight, any of that, and I didn't have crampons. Other than that, I lived in those, and they were, a cheap $35, $40 pair off of Amazon that I swear by now. I mean, anytime I go in something like that, they were worth their money and a lot more.
Yeah. So, you're doing that. You have a partner who's already injured and sick. You don't know what his condition is. I mean, I know you could communicate with him. You've got 0-0 weather. So even if something happened, nobody's coming to get you. Like you have to be very, you have to play those odds and be cautious. And you guys did exactly, like from my experiences doing that, like it was the most difficult thing for you to do, I'm sure, but it was absolutely the right thing that you had to do, for your own well-being, let alone potentially Donnie's. If you had to go and carry him out, like he's relying on you guys to get back to him.
Yep, absolutely.
The other thing is, I don't want to drive this conversation, but I think it's a perfect case in point of a trip where you talk to people and you say, I was wet the entire time I was out there, right? And even though you could potentially dry out, you could dry your base layers at night, I'm sure. I know the gear, right? But people are like, well, I can bring down and I can bring this and I can dry out and there's no way you're wet the whole time. And you're like, you've never been in that environment then. The humidity conspires against you, along with the dew point, along with the saturated ground. Like it all adds up to conspire for just a very wet and miserable climate.
Yeah, and you can't explain, we took a teepee with a stove, naively thinking, hey, we're going to be able to climb in here and warm up at night and dry everything out and it's all going to be great. There's standing water inside the teepee for one. I mean, you couldn't help it. We dug a trench around it. We did everything. Water is running down the stovepipe, and there's no way to completely seal that stovepipe hole. So water's just running down it like a river hitting the top of the stove. Secondly, I tried for an hour and a half to get a fire going. And I had I had pyro putty, I had all this fire starter stuff. I could not get wood to ignite up there. We had a hatchet. I was breaking wood in half. I was shaving it and everything. Little shavings of wood wouldn't even light. So, I mean, all of the fire, all the fuel up there is just so densely saturated that you couldn't get a fire going. So that was one. That was the first thing. Okay, we aren't going to be able to dry out. I only took one extra change of clothes for that time, thinking, hey, we're going to be able to dry out, so I can just swap out one gear while the other's drying. And like you said, I think I was equally as wet from the inside as from the outside, because you're wearing rain gear, and yeah, it's breathable. We have pit zips, all of that, but it's not fully breathable. You're still producing moisture inside, plus the moisture from the outside. And then, like you said, that humidity, everything was wet and everything stayed wet. So my only refuge, literally, I kept the inside of my little 2-man tent. I kept it completely dry. I would completely undress outside it in the vestibule and then climb in, and I made sure that my sleeping pad and my sleeping bag did not come in contact with anything wet, because that was all I had to climb into. And I knew if I was able to undress and climb into that sleeping bag, if it was dry, I knew I was safe. And so for 6 days, the inside of my sleeping bag got no moisture, and the outside of it stayed dry as well.
Yeah, no, it's such a critical point, and I think that the video did a really good job of showing that. But I'm glad you mentioned the fire, because you guys had a fire the first night, your unplanned night out. Of course, that was, you were on top. It was a little drier. The humidity wasn't what it was later on. But, often you hear people say, well, if I get in trouble, if I get wet, if I get cold, I'll just build a fire. And it's like that. So sometimes, but if that is your default answer, you're going to be sorely disappointed. And it's a very sobering fact when you try to do what you just described. And, after 3 hours of effort, the most warmth you're getting is the physical exertion of trying to blow on the fire to get it to sputter some smoke. You're like, wow, like all we have to rely on is our clothing, is our shelter, is our sleeping bag for, what could be potentially survival. I mean, Donnie was laying there. He's sick as a dog. He's cold. He's shivering. He's got a fever. He can't get out and move around. Like, that he was completely reliant on that equipment. He wasn't relying on any kind of external heat source. So yeah, it's that's where all this stuff kind of leads, where you're like trying to purchase the right gear or build the right thing or test the right product. All those things lead up to a hunt, like I said, graduate level, that you guys got to experience. Oh, I'm laughing with you, all in 6 or 7 days. But I mean, it made for an amazing video for sure. But yeah.
Yeah, no, and like you said, I was one that said I can get a fire going anywhere, and I always have. I mean, here in Idaho, we'll go out, cougar hunting with hounds or something in the winter and get stuck out overnight, or shed hunting in the spring and get into bad situations where it's, raining and then snowing and freezing overnight. I can always get a fire going. You find a dead tree, even in the middle of a downpour, and snap open one of the branches, it's dry enough on the inside that you can get a fire going. And, sub-zero temperatures, middle of a rainstorm, it's never been an issue, but I've never experienced saturation like that up there. There was no amount of flame that was going to dry that wood out and get it to burn.
Yeah. Yeah, no, a couple other notes that I made, today is like night movement. Like, you can't move through some of that terrain at night, even with a headlamp. It's like, it's dangerous. You're better off, like you guys did, stay in place, try to ride out the night. At least it looked like you had a tarp.
You want to know the story on that?
I do.
As we were moving in on the elk, so we didn't plan on staying out. We did not prepare to stay out. It was beautiful, clear weather. We weren't supposed to get any rain until 10 o'clock the next morning. So I didn't plan for food for dinner. I didn't plan for staying overnight, for shelter, for anything warm. I had a vest, and that was it, a base layer and a vest. And as we're moving in on this bull, right before I shot it, I look over, And I'm like, what is that over there? So I pull out my binoculars. Somebody had abandoned their tent there at some point in the past. And there was a ripped up rain fly off of a tent that was wadded up in the rocks there. So once we made the decision to stay, I said, I'm going back and getting that rain fly and at least putting it up over us, hopefully to trap in some of the heat. Didn't work to trap in heat. The heat that we were producing from that fire was so minimal that I sat there literally shivering all night. And then once it started raining, there were 3 of us crammed under this little ripped in half rain fly, and there was no way to keep out of the rain. So we were getting wet. The wind was blowing about 30 miles an hour. And I abandoned the fire and said, I've just got to start walking. The fire's not producing any heat. I've got to move.
Yeah. Hindsight, right? It's always 2020. But I mean, I think you were lucky to get the tarp. But especially in that environment. I actually, almost in any environment, like what I like to say is your clothing is kind of your first line of defense against the elements. Like, the show Naked and Afraid. Yeah, the reason they're afraid is because they're naked. So, you need that clothing. So and you guys obviously had good clothing, right? But if you get to the point where, you have a puffy jacket, you have a beanie, you have a ground pad to sit on, and you have some rain gear to block the wind or some rain, right? And then you can try to seek shelter. Like, maybe, and I don't know, you probably shouldn't have moved, but maybe you could have dropped down and gotten under a bush. But, when you're getting those unplanned nights out, like not truly a survival situation, but it certainly could have become that, right? If the weather was worse or something like that. But, that's why it's like, I always try to plan contingencies, and you don't want to carry too much, and you don't want to you didn't need to bring a stove and food necessarily. But, when you get into situations like that, you're like, man, what was would that 12 ounces extra of a clothing layer been that, big a deal in hindsight? And you can get away with a lot down here. You just can't get away with it up in that country.
No, that's the thing. I mean, Donnie's the only one that had rain gear. So he had, I think he had his Jetstream jacket. And I don't even remember this when I go back and watch the video, but I think he gave me his rain jacket and he kept the Jetstream or vice versa. And then he gave John his rain pants. And Donnie always has a big food bag, so he had extra bars and everything. I'd killed 2 ptarmigan on the way in there, and then we had the elk there, so we had meat. I mean, it wasn't like we were sitting there starving, but there was no comfort food for sure.
Yeah.
But Donnie was prepared. But like you said, had we thrown a dehydrated meal with a stove and fuel and a puffy and a rain shell in there, that might have added 5 pounds total. Most likely not even that much, but 5 pounds you aren't going to notice. I was light anyways. I was probably at 25 pounds in my pack. So I mean, a pretty light day pack with water and everything. So another 5 pounds wouldn't have said, oh, we aren't going to be able to make it that far over there. And I think looking forward, that was my number one lesson, or the first lesson I learned anyway, was if you're going to go out and expect to go for 6 or 7 hours straight in that kind of terrain and condition, pack the extra 5 pounds. Hands down, no question asked. Don't even think about it.
But you didn't necessarily expect to hike 7 hours to find elk, though, either, one way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we knew where the elk were. We saw them when we were flying in, and I said, okay, I'm looking at the map here, and it's this far. It'll take us 2.5, 3 hours to get there. And the one drainage that we had to cross, I was looking at it thinking we can be across that in 30 minutes. It took us 2.5 hours to get across that because there's one main drainage, but there's about 6 draws that you don't even see. And somebody said that when you're looking at a map of that area, there are a lot of 99-foot cliffs hidden in that 100-foot contour.
Exactly. Yep, very much. I mean, I love moving through that high alpine country. It's amazing stuff. Once you're up there, you feel like you can cruise, and I like that you can see, but there's so much micro terrain that just chews up time and adds vertical, that you just can't plan for, whatsoever. I was curious about, I know you're supposed to be asking me questions, but I was really curious about your footwear, your socks. Obviously you guys had gaiters, which is totally clutch in that environment. But how did that system work for you guys? I mean, you're covering a lot of ground. It didn't seem like you were getting your feet chewed up too bad.
My feet were hammered like they've never been before. Tips of every one of my toes, so not on the very tip, but on the knuckle of all of my toes, wore raw. I was in wet boots from when we got back to camp after spending the night out. So it would have been day 2, middle of the day 2. From then on, my feet were never dry. And I had, I think, 3 pair of socks, maybe 4 pair of socks. So I was able to get socks dried out for the most part. But within 3 minutes of putting them in my boot, I just couldn't get the boots dry. And it wasn't, the boots didn't fail, the gaiters didn't fail, the rain gear didn't fail. It's just a matter of you can't keep dry in that. And that was, footwear's hard. And when you're walking that far in those kind of conditions, in mud, the trekking poles, we'd put the trekking pole in the ground and it would sink in about a foot. And then you'd pull it back out. And I'm using the trifold ones that have the shock cord in the middle to pull them all together, and every single time I'd pull that out of the ground, you'd hear this thunk swack as that pulls apart and then snaps back together every step. And so your boots, they're sinking in, you're pulling up mud with that. And we had the gaiters, the rain gear, and the boots, and I had them overlapped and laid in there like you would want to build a roof, so no water's running down inside of another one, and you just couldn't keep the moisture out of the boots. And it could have been, internal moisture from sweating, running down the base layer, running down the socks, whatever, but there was standing water in my boots pretty much the entire time.
Yeah, and once those boots get wet, any boots like that get wet, doesn't matter the brand, they're not going to dry in the field.
No,
they're
not
just
in that
not
condition.
Yeah, there's something called a vapor barrier sock. So, Randy, remember when your mom used to put your foot in a bread bag before she put it in the winter boot? So that's like the most basic form of a vapor barrier sock. But, oftentimes in those kind of conditions, when the boot's not going to get dried, it's normally cool or even cold, so they're freezing at night. You can dry your sock out, but then you can put the vapor barrier over the dry sock, and then that protects you from the cold, wet boot. Now, your foot will sweat till at least there's 100% humid environment inside, but it takes many hours. So as opposed to 3 minutes, it's more like 3 hours. And then, so that at least buys you some time every day. But that's just one of those things that you're never there's just no perfect system really to get that. And it's so critical because if you can't walk, you're helpless in that country.
Yeah. And that's one thing I noticed. I mean, I was so cold, it's 46 degrees, something like that, which you think, 46 degrees is, that's not freezing. I'm fine. You get saturated wet in that when we would stop just to eat or take a break, I had 10 minutes maybe, and then it's like, hey, we got to go. I'm cold, and I'm not going to warm up just sitting here. Yeah. So that definitely was a thought that, hey, if I break an ankle, if I tweak a knee, and I'm stuck here and can't move, I don't have very long. I mean, you literally will go hypothermic in, I don't know the time, but 46 degrees, soaking wet, chilled to the bone from hiking. You get stationary too long, and it doesn't take long to go hypothermic.
Yeah, no, not at all. And you have to, so those are, you have to kind of keep that in mind with what you do and how far you extend yourself and, the route you take or the risk you take. Cause you just can't afford that in that country.
Yeah. And that's the other hard part that, I just don't know how to manage the moisture when it's that wet outside. It's so steep. The terrain is so steep and you have so much weight on your back. You're exerting energy, even though it's 46 degrees out. You think, well, if the rain gear works, it's keeping the water out from the outside. But realistically, you're producing so much moisture on the inside. Whether you're in rain gear or not, you're going to be sweating like crazy, working that hard. And just that moisture management was brutal. And like you said, fortunately, I was able to climb in dry to my sleeping bag every night and find a system that worked to put on at least somewhat dry clothing in the morning. It was never dry, but at least it wasn't completely, I wrung it out at night as best I could and literally would get, a couple cups of water out of my base layers just from all the moisture. And you want to talk about stink. I've sweated and been on a backcountry hunt for 8 days without any kind of a bath or a shower or anything. When you're wet like that and nothing dries out, I stunk it was a smell that I have never smelled before.
I was wondering about that poor pilot that picked you guys up.
I did too.
Stuck in that small plane. I'm like, that poor guy.
Yeah.
But, I'd rather have it be 30 degrees or less than 32 degrees to 50-ish degrees, because when it's colder, generally it's a drier climate.
Yep.
And, you can kind of prepare for that. But that environment you're talking about, it's that middle ground that's so difficult. And, what nobody talks about is when the dew point and humidity are what you talked about, not to get into the science of it, but it's actually when rain gear actually performs the worst. It doesn't actually breathe almost at all, because you have a very saturated environment inside the garment and a very saturated environment outside the garment. There's nowhere for it to move, so it just stays where it is. And that is just a difficult environment to work in. And, if you hadn't, but if people hadn't experienced that before, they may blame the gear or they may blame themselves. And it's like, no, this is just a situation that you're in right now. It's literally, to me, the worst kind of climatic conditions you can be in, because you're right on the edge of hypothermia. It almost teases you that it's going to get warm enough, and you kind of are warm when you're moving, and as soon as you stop, then you cool off right away. And so it's just this constant ping pong effect back and forth.
Yeah, and typically, you have a day off. You can take a day off and rest and, all of that. But we had to push ourselves for 5 straight days there. And, you're thinking constantly, I've got to push as hard as I can, but I've got to save energy for tomorrow. And, I can't afford to stop. But we can't just sit under a tree for 2 hours and take a nap or a rest, because you just can't stay warm. So you've got to be continually going. And the one thing I wanted to ask John was, going into the sleeping bag with wet clothes, I didn't have the confidence to do that. So I didn't dry my base layers out each night. I mean, it was on my mind every night as I'm climbing in the sleeping bag. I should wear these, because I know I've heard you talk about it. I've heard lots of other people talk about climbing in your sleeping bag with wet base layers, and it'll dry them out. So can you talk about that? And I'm going to do it. I mean, I'm going to prove it in a controlled environment, at least here, before I get somewhere like that. Because last thing I wanted to do was climb in my only dry space and not be able to dry it out.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, this is a great question, and it'll maybe dovetail into a question I wanted to ask you back. But so first of all, I'm not asking you what brand or bag you had, but what I would say is that in an environment like that, or any environment you're going into, what I like to say is you have to build the clothing system and the sleeping system as one unit. So the sleeping bag, to me, is an extension of the clothing system. So during the day, the puffy jacket keeps me warm at rest breaks. And at night, there's just a different silhouette of a puffy jacket that I climb inside to insulate me the same way, right? So if you have the wrong bag, or maybe I should say an insulation that's not up to the task, if you were to get in there wet, you would probably compromise that one respite you have from the cold and the damp, right? But if you work them together and build them in conjunction, then, well, you've seen the videos I've done, but worst case scenario, you could get in there completely soaking wet, and it would keep you warm at a minimum. So let's just say you don't get in there soaking wet, but maybe just base layers. That will dry out. Now, that sleeping bag, if it's got like a synthetic insulation, it'll manage that moisture. So that bag may get it will get heavier over time, because the moisture is not going to move all the way through, for the same reason it's not going to move through the rain gear. but it's going to pull the moisture off that clothing into the insulation, and it's going to still continue to keep you warm. So you're going to be able to dry out at night. The moisture will move into the bag. Some will move through just because your body heat's pushing it, right? But I like to say, like, that's my last line of defense from the cold, is that sleeping bag. So you did the right thing to not compromise it if you hadn't tested it. But this is why I'm such a huge proponent of training with whatever gear you assemble as a system, as a unit, for the conditions you expect to encounter. So if you and I are living in Arizona, we're going to go all on a Arizona elk hunt. I mean, let's be honest, for the most part, it's easy living. Now, I've had some really poor weather in northern Arizona in November for sure. But my point is, that's a far cry from coastal Alaska in September, right? Where you know it's going to be wet, you know it's going to be damp. And so you pick the right tool for the job, you pair the clothing and the sleep system together, and then you test it. And it would absolutely, I can tell you that if I was there with you, I would have been getting in all my clothes every night into my sleeping bag. Now, not my rain gear, but that's what I would have been doing. But I've got practice, I've got confidence, I've got the system that works. But, when people kind of look at that and go, well, nobody would ever do that. And I'm like, okay, so what about if you're on a float trip? What about if you're pack rafting for shed antlers, or, into a whitetail spot, or in Alaska? I mean, there's so many ways to get wet that you may have to, set up a camp and ride out the night and try to dry yourself out, or just continue to, make the situation worse. That's where I think all that begins to come into play.
Yeah, no, and that's, for me, just not having that confidence of knowing it was going to dry out. But will there ever be a point where the sleeping bag becomes saturated? Will it continue moving that moisture night after night? As you're climbing in there wet, it's obviously not going to move all the moisture out every night, but will it continue to cycle through and you'll be able to dry out night after night? Or does it reach a point where it's like sleeping bag's just heavy, it's soaked now and not working?
So a great answer. So the moisture will continue to move through, but it will move through at a slower rate over time, because the insulation, it's not that the insulation's wet, it's that there's more moisture getting trapped in the insulation, right? Or depending on the type of insulation, the loft begins to clump or compress, so you don't have as much dead air space. So that's where you're going to get a reduction in the warmth of the bag. But, I've been out where same conditions as you, and every day you're wet and every day you get in there. But depending on the insulation, like a synthetic, even though it's wet, it's going to continue to, one, insulate you, and two, keep you warm. But here's the other thing you have to take into consideration outside of a ground pad is, at that point, we already talked about, you can't start a fire. Like, you can't. It's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. So what is the heat source that ultimately keeps you warm and ultimately helps you dry out? It's your body. It's the internal combustion engine, or your metabolic engine. That's your body, right? So that now goes into, what do you bring to fuel that engine? What is your food? What is your hydration? What are the calories? What does that look like? So, I was curious because, obviously I saw you eating some bars and things, and I know that there's plentiful water, however you were purifying it or filtering it. But you had to have, my guess is you had to have had a pretty good idea of your nutrition and hydration, because you were continuing to put out a huge effort. You were continuing to have at least enough metabolic heat to dry out some of that clothing at night, right? And although you're never going to be able to eat or hydrate enough, I like to call this, when we go in the backcountry, I just classify it as crisis nutrition. You're not going to be able to eat or drink at optimal levels, but you have to eat and drink well enough to succeed at what you guys just did. Like literally, imagine if we said, "Hey, Corey, I'm going to put 85 pounds in your back. I'm going to put you in steep mountains. I need you and 2 other buddies to travel." And the last time I heard, it was 22 miles. So I'm guessing it was more like a marathon or something, maybe more. And you'd be like, "Oh my God, what you would bring to eat and hydrate would be more than you probably ate and hydrated over the course of 5 days. And you'd have brought that for one." So, whatever you guys did, you nailed that. But that's where that's where all this begins to come together, because if you can't fuel the body, at a certain point, you're still going to put off a little heat, and what you have is still going to insulate you, but you're still going to get cold and start to spiral, because hypothermia is just losing more body heat than you can retain. So if I can't feed that to create body heat and I'm losing it, that's where you get into hypothermia, right? So you guys nailed that. I don't know what you did. At least cognitively, you were talking coherently. That guy was running cameras. Like, you guys had your shit together. You're in reaching back and forth. You're communicating with the air base. Like, so you had that figured out, it looks like.
Yeah, and I think nutrition-wise, when we hunt here, we're putting out a pretty good effort. And so we've realized that, hey, I can remember on a Wyoming elk hunt, gosh, what's it been, 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, I ate 4,400 or 4,600 calories in one day on our last day there, and I was still craving food. Like, I was hungry. And I just remember thinking, I don't eat half this much on a normal day. If I ate 4,600 calories sitting at home, I'd put on 5 pounds a day. But in that situation, and especially after 8 days of doing that, on that last day, I couldn't eat enough to fill the tank. But yeah, I had everything planned out. Each day was a package, and I had, different sources of calories. So it wasn't like it was all protein or it wasn't all carbs. I had it broken up there, and obviously we've dialed that in over several years. And so my food source in Alaska really, the difference, like you said, we had to make sure we were producing heat rather than just producing energy to go up a mountain and chase an elk. So, I don't think I ever felt hungry, like I was lacking nutrition. And then water. Donnie just put his cup outside his tent and let the rain fly. Literally it would fill it. I think he said it was taking 15 minutes or something to fill 2 cups, whatever that is. 16 ounces of water or something. It was just running off of it. But yeah, there was water sources everywhere. We had I forget, John uses a platypus, I think, and I had a Katadyn, just a pump filter, and there was never a problem finding a stagnant water source to filter from.
Yeah. Were you guys feeling like, after that type of physical effort, were you starting to get almost nauseous, to where like big meals and things just didn't seem that appetizing to you, and you were doing more snacks, or what did that look like?
No, in fact, I saved my favorite meals purposely for the end of the hunt, and we used the peak refuel, or the dehydrated meals we took. And man, beef stroganoff and home style chicken and rice never tasted so good as those last couple nights. And that last grind going back up to our spike camp when we're packing meat, that's all I was thinking about, was I can't wait to get back and have some beef stroganoff. And so no, we never got to a point where food wasn't appealing.
Yeah. I think that speaks to, your guys' experience, because the folks I talk to, it really surprises them sometimes. Like, they either carry not enough, and so you have those issues, or they carry so much that they can't consume those calories, not because they're not hungry, but it's not the right food. It's not appealing, like how many, you can't only eat so many bars, right? And you can only eat, I know on certain trips that I've been on that, I literally bring a bottle of some type of like almond oil, olive oil, something like that, and just literally do shots of oil, because it's 120 calories per teaspoon, I believe.
Yeah.
And so it's like, and it doesn't sound appealing right now sitting here talking to you guys, but out there it's like, man, I need a shot of oil, right? It's the craziest thing sometimes, but you just have to figure that out like everybody's got to figure it out for themselves. You can't eat the same thing I do. I can't eat the same thing Randy does. Everybody's got to kind of figure it out, for themselves to kind of keep moving.
Yeah, and that's one thing I did pack was packets of peanut butter and almond butter. And, and that, like you said, that's huge. Just it's a different kind of nutrition. And the bars are great, but they're usually loaded in a lot of carbs. And then the dehydrated meals are great because they're loaded in a lot of protein. But if you don't get enough fats out there, it's, you can lose energy pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, I can lose a few pounds. I got plenty to burn. I got a couple marathons on me. So food generally isn't the biggest issue. It's just keeping the metabolism stoked. For me, it's all about hydration. I have to hydrate far more out there. But that's what I was going to get to is when you get to the point where you guys are wearing rain gear because you have to, and then you're moving. We already talked. It's not going to breathe. You're literally dehydrating yourself as you're moving, and then have to be conscious of that to rehydrate enough so that you can continue to operate out there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've noticed in cold weather. We never drink enough because it's cold. You just don't feel, it's 110 degrees and you're hiking up a mountain. You're drinking everything you've got. When it's 12 degrees and you're hiking up a mountain, you aren't drinking at all. Like you can go clear to the top of the mountain and never take a drink, but you'll still dehydrate. And that's another thing in Alaska, that everything's so wet that you're not thinking about getting water inside you. You're trying to keep water out of your shell, and you aren't thinking about putting it inside of you. And so we did. I learned to carry a bladder and use a hydration system like that because I just don't stop to pull out a water bottle. I just won't do it. It's too much effort. Take the pack off and get a bottle out. So having that bladder, we would fill it up with 3 liters every day and make sure that when I got back to camp, we were having to pump more water for dinner. And we definitely kept up on the hydration, I think.
Yeah, it sounded like you guys had a tough time finding a campsite, finding any type of flat ground up there, huh?
Yeah, we our first campsite, I'm looking around going, well, there's got to be someplace dry you can throw a tent, and there wasn't. The ground was not dry, and we didn't take any tarps or anything to put under it. And it definitely, I gained some confidence in my tent because no water came up through the bottom, and no water came in through the top or anywhere else unless I took it in there. So that was good. But yeah, just finding the place I ended up pitching my tent for our spike camp was just in a little depression. And the reason I did that was because it was the only place I could get out of the wind, at least to break the wind in the first 2 feet of the tent. So I wasn't laying in the wind, and knew the water would be able to run down and not stack up in there. But yeah, I had just basically enough room for me to lay down between a couple rocks, and it's tough to find a flat spot.
Well, it didn't look like there was even enough room for your cameraman at that spike camp to, pitch a tent right next to you.
He probably could have been within 20 or 30 feet of me. He chose to be 200 yards up the hill for, I think he's just antisocial. But I'm down setting my tent, and I turn around and look, and there's no tent there. I'm like, where'd you put your tent? And he's like, oh, it's back over here. And yeah, he was off by himself.
Well, that campsite selection can be so critical. And, obviously the terrain, the weather's going to dictate, what's the lesser of two evils. Do I sit in a little depression where maybe it's kind of comfortable and try to channel water around me because it's not going to be exposed to the nuclear winds out there? But yeah, I was on a goat hunt one time on the south end of Kodiak Island, and we got trapped in our tents for 4 days. It got so bad. It ended up being we were on the edge of a typhoon. Didn't know it at the time, but it got so bad that we had a bear fence around our camp. We had a teepee pitched for our cook shack. We had to collapse the teepee, when we weren't in it, and we can only get in it for a couple hours in the evening when it kind of calmed down. But it was so bad that I still to this day don't know where they came from, but I had worms, night crawlers, like somehow get pushed up out of the ground because it was so so saturated. I had worms all over my tent. I had worms all over my sleeping bag. I mean, the book I had brought, because they didn't have, like Kindles back then, but like the book I had was completely saturated. I ended up just, but it was horrible how it became so wet inside that tent, and that's like your little sanctuary that I was like trying, you're sponging it out or using a sock or whatever it is. And yeah, that was one of the more enjoyable experiences I've had, just laying there in a typhoon. But, yeah.
Well, and that's the thing. I can't sit. Like I mean, I know most of us probably can't sit and don't like to. I just can't lay there. I probably would rather get up and go walk around in the rain and be soaking wet than sit in a tent to stay dry. And obviously, if you're hunting, it's not efficient at all to be out there. But fortunately, we were packing, and I knew we could at least keep moving, because man, there is nothing worse. There is no slower day than sitting in a tent with nothing to do.
If you hadn't killed that bull on the first day or the next morning when the weather was good, do you think you'd even had an opportunity?
I don't think
they'd
so.
have just shut down, or?
We covered the country. We shot the bull in, obviously, because we had to go back and pack the meat from the kill site. We covered that. We covered deep timber. We covered flat. We covered steep. And we never saw an elk, never heard a bugle, never saw a track the rest of the time. So, I mean, we're talking 150 or 160 elk on the entire island. In that particular area, that one herd was there with a couple bulls, and who knows where they go when it rains, but they didn't go anywhere that we went. So yeah, trying to find an elk, and that's what I've told several people. I have no doubt if we wouldn't have had that clear day on opening day, we wouldn't have killed an elk, just because you can't find them, you can't hunt them, you can't hear, you can't glass. I mean, there's no way to find elk in that terrain.
Yeah, I did a hunt, the first Roosevelt I killed, again with a rifle. I never killed one with the bow, but so we get dropped off on one side of the island, and the idea was a little different than yours, but our idea was we were just going to, hike the island with our packs on our back until we found the elk, and then eventually, depending on, if we were at the halfway point or not, we would either go back to that beach or we would continue across the island to the other side. And so we get off the boat, and the gentleman's loitering offshore, and we're, taking off our hip boots and stuff, and we're going to throw them on the boat. We don't want to carry that stuff, of course, right, in our dry bags. And, our guns are just laying there, just unloaded. And, we live there. We're residents. We know what we're doing. And the guy starts motoring to shore, and he's waving like this. And we're trying to figure out what he's saying to us. Finally, we hear bear. He's saying something about a bear. And we turn around, and literally at the high tide line of the beach, about 50 yards away, this beautiful, almost cinnamon-colored 9-foot brown bear is just walking right at the high tide line right past us, right? So, of course, everybody's scrambling for their gun, loading. Bear doesn't care. He could care less. Anyways, we hiked to the top of the mountain, found the elk right away, ended up shooting a bull. But here's the difference, Corey. I had 4 other full-grown men with me. So we killed that bull. We quartered him up, which is like quartering up a horse. I think you talked about that in your video. You didn't say it that way. But then there were 5 grown men to carry this elk. We took the hide too, but to carry this elk, and we just kept hiking, spiked out, and kept hiking across the island to get out of there. Those things are absolute beasts. And I am not somebody who likes to go back for multiple trips. One, because of the situation you ran into up there, which is, listen, there's a really good chance, even in the Alpine, like you're going to run into a bear. But if you're in the vegetation, like it's just almost a death wish, But anyways, that hunt worked out okay. But I was thinking about that when I was watching that video.
No, and there were people that questioned, why'd you guys go back to camp without hauling meat the first trip? All of that. And honestly, we were so close to hypothermia from staying out overnight. We didn't know how we were going to get the meat back. So to carry it 7 hours all the way back to camp didn't make sense. And we ended up going halfway and then finding a route down to the lake. So it would have been unproductive to carry it back there. The other thing is there's no way to keep the meat dry. You've got game bags, but here you hang it in a tree, and even in a hard rainstorm, game bags might not even get a drop of water on them. Up there were no trees. There were literally no trees that we could hang it in. We had to put the game bags on a rock, and it cooled. We got the meat; it was all boned out, and it cooled just fine. But yeah, we couldn't carry it back. Turned out to be only 2 of us packing, and with an elk that size, it was not a one-trip deal. And I've told several people the only way you could ever convince me to go back and do that hunt is if I had 4 guys who are willing just to pack meat. Mm-hmm. I can pack all my gear. I'm fine with that. I can hunt. I can pack my load of meat, but I don't ever want to have to make a multiple trip pack again in that kind of condition and that kind of terrain.
Yeah. Were you guys able to, or did you bone it out at all?
Oh, it was 100% boned out.
Yeah. I know some, it depends on the unit up there that, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Generally elk you can, but obviously meat care because of the temperature is not that big an issue, but it's the, it's the predators up there, be it wolves or bears. And, in the past on different hunts, not where I'm trying to count every ounce, where you could take some garbage bags, you could put the meat in the garbage bag and then put it in some of that water with rocks on top. And, a lot of times that'll keep them at bay, at least for a little while. But, that's a whole nother aspect. So like, I'm a big proponent of what I call the care and feeding of the trip. And so you're a really experienced elk hunter, right? You know how to shoot the bow, you know how to call, you know the animal behavior, you know how to quarter up the bull. You have those really technical skills dialed. The other side you also have dialed is what we've talked about. Most of it is what I call the care and feeding. So you could plan the trip, you could feed yourself, you could clothe yourself, you could set up a shelter, you could select a campsite, you could do all those things, right? You could get into a pseudo survival situation. You knew how to manage that, you knew how to communicate. But so many people nowadays, it seems like, they want to get proficient at calling, they want to get really good at shooting, but they don't actually have mastered the skill sets to commute through the environment, to live there easy enough that they can then implement those kind of more technical skills, right? The shooting, the calling, the animal behavior part. You kind of have to get out and train. I'm a big proponent of like, hey, just go backpacking. Like we're probably all of the age where, we either grew up backpacking or went backpacking with our family or, our friends. And you kind of learn like how to live out there and be comfortable. And like I said, collect water, feed yourself, light your stove, set up your tent, select your campsite, all those things, navigate. That's why what you did in that trip was like such a graduate level, because you had to have, I don't want to use mastery too loosely, but you really did have to master all those skills because of the challenging environment the whole thing was kind of put under, to pull that off.
Yep, for sure. And it's, it goes back to, I'm 46 years old. I've been in the outdoors my entire life. And I can remember my first true backpacking trip. I was 18, had just graduated high school, and it was an external frame backpack with a green Army canvas duffel with everything I could possibly stuff in there. It must have been 90 pounds. I took a fry pan. I took a fry pan and a stick of butter.
There you go.
And I took cans of pork and beans. I mean, we didn't have backpacking gear back then. And so, I've learned the hard way, like most of us have, that, I've done it the wrong way enough times in good conditions that I've dialed things in so that when you do get in those bad situations and bad conditions, at least that portion, the living portion, the commuting portion, like you said, is at least dialed enough that it doesn't become too dangerous. You don't put yourself in dangerous situations. You're able to maintain that safety. And I think that's a huge thing that a lot of times gets overlooked, that there's people from Alaska that are absolutely used to that. And they can go out there and live on an island in those conditions for 10 days, but they probably don't have the elk hunting skill set to get it done. Or there's guys that are great elk hunters that haven't been in that situation, in those conditions, that, like the pilot said, 2-3 days tops is what most people make it, and then they call and say, hey, we're ready to be picked up. And it's the conditions that do it. It's not the elk hunting is so bad that the elk hunting is rough, but it's just being there in those conditions and not being prepared for it. And I think physically is important, but mentally is a huge part of it. There was never a time where I thought, we're done, we're pushing the button, we're leaving. Whether it was before we killed, after we killed, during the packing, any of that. If we needed to stay another 5 days down at the lake waiting for air transport to come in, we could have done it. I was more concerned at that point about getting Donnie out of there. Once we got the meat packed, like, hey, let's get him out and get that figured out. Because we didn't know. I mean, he's sitting there with the SOS button under his thumb, with pressure on it a couple times. And the only option then is the Coast Guard comes in a helicopter with a long line, and you dangle from a long line till they can get somewhere they can land, because that's your only option if you want to push the SOS button. So I think the mental part of it is just can't be overstated. Physically you can be as prepared as possible, but mentally you just have to know, I'm in it for the long haul. I'm safe. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, there's some elements that I don't like. It's completely uncomfortable, but I'm not going to die here. I'm just going to weather it out and make it through.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you guys talk to a lot of people. I know I talk to some people, but there's a lot of people from back east that are coming west to hunt elk, hunt mule deer, whatever the case may be. And, case in point, you guys were moving through terrain that, clearly you know how to navigate, but it was terrain that you were a little unfamiliar with. And so your what I call rates of movement, your rates of movement were off. So you're like, oh, we could be there in 30 minutes, and it was 2.5 hours. And so oftentimes what I hear from people is they'll follow one of your courses, and they'll get on there and they'll do all the e-scouting, and they'll drop all these pins, and they'll be like, I can go here, and then I can go here, and here's my campsite, and here's my water source, and here's my glassing knob, and here's a elk wallow. But the distances are just out of the realm of realistic rates of movement, because they either don't know the environment, they haven't tried that. Most people overestimate how quickly they can walk. And then you factor in kind of this silent, tasteless, soundless thing called altitude that, especially when you're coming from back east, really starts to kick you in the pants. And so that's why I say, come out and come out and go backpacking. Come out and go bear hunting in the area that you want to go hunt in, or you think you want to go hunt in. Like if you guys went back to Alaska in the same place, I'm convinced you would do it a little bit different. You would plan a little bit different, but it's because you've got that familiarity now in that environment. You understand that terrain. You understand, I can, read the veg by the color of it, or, you don't want to go below this elevation because it's just hell on earth, bushwhacking, or, whatever the case may be. But, understanding and having that familiarity, and we all get out of our comfort zone going to these new areas, but, sometimes you can't execute the plan that you had because you just aren't familiar enough with that environment to move through it efficiently.
Yeah, like I said, we saw those elk from miles away, and looking at it, in Idaho, I see an elk at 2.5 miles away. yeah, it's steep. Yeah, it's rugged, but there's a ridge system that's going to get me there. And I can get on that ridge system and cover ground really efficiently. And so I'm looking up there going, okay, once we make it over here, I don't see a single depression anywhere. It's just a big ridge. It's above alpine. We can just get on that and just cruise across there. And then you get there and realize it's a 20-foot drop straight down, and you're navigating, on your hands, climbing down through the rocks, and then up the other side with trekking poles. And then you get up there and you have to detour around another big obstacle. I mean, it's just, you can't, like you said, the unfamiliarity with it. And once we made it through, figured out how to get from our camp to the elk, and then from the elk to the lake, it was easy navigating once we had done it. We knew where the downfalls, we knew where the obstacles were. Going back up the first time was a nightmare from the lake. And then we found this huge chute that had water running down. There was a stream running down this chute, but it was way easier to get right in the middle of that stream and step on the rocks and use them almost like a staircase going back up the mountain, rather than navigating through all the brush and the just wet, slippery terrain. And so, I would do it way differently. I would access it from a different point. I would pack to a different point. I would camp in a different place, all those things. But even knowing all that, I still, the desire to go back is very, very low.
Yeah, no, I was breaking out in cold sweats. I mean, I'm not scared of telling you, I've become hydrophobic. Like, I don't even want to get in the shower half the time, having lived up there for so long. But no, the reason I love that film, and I'm glad I watched it again today, is because it is literally a tutorial, as far as I'm concerned, for somebody planning almost any backcountry or wilderness hunt. It doesn't matter if you're coming from Pennsylvania to Colorado, or you're going from Idaho up to, Alaska to hunt elk. The logistics, the planning, the partnerships, like the contingencies for your unplanned night out. The partner being sick. Like, I mean, I'm in some regard, I'm sorry you had to experience that, but I appreciate it because you guys did such an amazing job putting that together. But like, to me, I was just like taking notes. I'm like, teachable moment, teachable moment, teachable moment, teachable moment, that you can just take and apply in so many ways. Let's be honest. You went from Idaho. You've been running around the West for years. I've seen you hunting in Wyoming with grizzly bears all over the place, right? I mean, you're aware, but it doesn't bother you. You guys were still able to get it done. You went and pushed your comfort zone up in Alaska, and got the full meal deal. But if somebody's coming from Pennsylvania to go to Colorado to hunt elk for their first time, like, that's just as big a leap for that person.
Yeah.
And I think even though the environment's different, there's so many things that you could learn from watching that film and like digging into all those different aspects that people could really pay attention to. And I think really help them, on whatever next elk adventure they want to go on.
Absolutely. So, John, with that being said, what were the top 3 things that you would critique on that and say, you should have done this different, or this would have been a better way to handle that?
Yeah. So,
and you're not going to hurt my feelings at all, because I know we weren't prepared, and there's a lot for us to learn.
No. And like I said, it's very easy to be an armchair quarterback, but kind of in order of progression that I kind of saw, the first one would be, for me personally, especially in that environment, but just as a general statement, I never go anywhere, no matter the season. I never go anywhere without a puffy jacket. I never go anywhere without some type of wind shell. So that could be a rain jacket. It could be just a light wind shirt, something like that. A little piece of ground pad. And normally, depending on the environment, either I know I can get under the tree as a shelter, or I bring some type of tarp. So my point is, that survival kit, right, all together, fire marking, all that kind of thing, I can ride out almost anything, because I can, my survival priorities, I can seek shelter, I can get some water, and a little bit of food. And so if I can do that and use my clothes as a first line of defense, now I'm not critiquing as a sense that you guys screwed up, but potentially you could have killed that bull, had those things, you did the right thing, rode out the night on top of the mountain, and carried the first load of meat off. You could have done that. I think you actually made the right decision. I could tell I know you not great, but a little bit. I could tell that you were in a way. I was like, these guys are smart. They're not carrying elk off the mountain right now. Your priority was to take care of yourselves first. The elk can sit there. You did what you needed to, but you needed to get off the mountain. So I always try to bring the clothing, the little bit of survival kit. Obviously, the knowledge weighs nothing to do that. The second one I think we've discussed is I train to where my system and my clothing and sleep system integrate. I would absolutely have been in that bag every night, drying my clothes out. Now, this is coming from 15 years of experience in Alaska, so a little bit different, right? And then just clothing wise.
Before we move
go ahead.
on that, on the sleeping bag, so synthetic sleeping bag, you don't want to do it in a down bag. Is that correct?
That's correct for a couple reasons, but yeah.
What about a treated down? If you have a sleeping bag with the treated down.
So I can't speak to every treated down, but in my experience, especially in the environment that you're in, okay, so not you spill a cup of soup on you, but you're in a very unpermissive, 100% saturated environment. Treated down will work if you're just trying to push some moisture through like you were trying to dry your clothing out. Where treated down begins to falter is when it's under compression. So you have this moisture moving from your wet clothing through that insulation. We've already said it's not going to move all the way through because humid inside, humid outside. So there's going to be moisture in there. As soon as you start to roll over and compress under your elbow, compress on your back, compress on your side, there's moisture in there. Those feathers will begin to clump. You get clumping, you lose loft, you lose warmth. So to me, the idiot-proof way, and I guess that's why I do it, is in that type of environment, I like to bring synthetic because I know worst case scenario, if I fell in the river and everything was wet, I could wring it out. It wouldn't hold any moisture necessarily in the fiber, but that it wouldn't lose its loft and would continue to keep me warm, right? Not at 100%, but at a much better level than any kind of down. So that's where you're trying to pair the clothing system and the bag, right? So everybody's got to kind of figure that out from themselves. The only other thing I would say about the clothing is, and maybe you didn't know about it, but I'd have brought some vapor barrier socks because I just know from experience there's no way you can keep your feet dry and your boots are going to get wet. Like you did it, the shingle layer with the rain gear and the gaiters and everything, that was perfect, but you're just going to get them wet. And you weren't walking around necessarily like your feet were hammered, but but it certainly could have been a lot worse, I'm sure, right? Like if you couldn't move. The only last thing, just to be kind of hypercritical, but I touched on this as well. I don't know how you navigate, but again, knowing the terrain, having that familiarity is super, super important. But when you guys were going down that mountain and got cliffed out, maybe you could have seen it on a topo map with contour lines. Maybe you couldn't have, but trying to pick the path of least resistance to get you where you want to go in that country is so critical because you can't physically see landmarks on the ground because of the vegetation. As a general rule, in that country, I like to stay out of ravines and drainages because you get in one, you might not be able to climb out. You might have a 20-foot waterfowl that doesn't show up on a 50-foot contour line, and you're kind of hemmed in. But anyways, But again, Corey, you guys made the only really right decision, which is, the hardest thing to do is climb out, and that's exactly what you had to do. So, yeah, could you always do it better? We always write down lessons learned. We've all been doing this a long time, and I still screw up. I went on my first ski tour this year. I forgot stuff because I was like, I don't need to write it down. I've been doing this long enough. Sure enough, I forgot things. I could make it work, but what the video showed me was you guys were out there in a very difficult environment, but you literally you had the experience to play every scenario the right way, in my opinion. So those were the three that kind of popped to mind.
Yeah, and that navigation piece, we were looking for the easiest, most direct route to get that meat down, knowing that we had a lot of meat and only 2 guys to pack it. And we could see treetops, which that's, you could only see 100 yards max, but we could see treetops in the fog. And I thought if there's trees there, they're not growing out of a cliff. There's got to be some kind of navigational terrain there. And then the other thing, there was an old rope tied to a tree that dropped down onto that ridge. And I thought somebody else has either came up or gone down right here before.
Interesting.
And who knows, looking back, we may have been able to make it. That might have been the worst point, and from there down, it would have been easier. Now knowing what the lake looks like in the daylight and without fog and rain, we wouldn't have been in a very good place on the lake as far as where we came out. There was nothing flat. It was just rocks and basically an avalanche chute that came out into the lake there. So the way we ended up going was a much better route. I would have loved to have had just a clear day to stand up there and look and pick that apart, but you just don't get that. And like you said, that terrain, not only the vegetation being thick and not being able to see, but then you add the fog and the rain to it, and 100 yards is max. Even above the alpine, looking down on it, you just can't see.
Yeah, no, it's horrible. I'll tell you though, the blacktail hunters in that country are obsessive, and that's probably who put a rope there. And my guess is if you had half a deer on your back because you had a buddy, like, you might have made a different decision at that point.
Yeah.
But when you got 100 pounds of gear, dead weight, literally on your back, like, that rope in that situation, wet, tired, like, it's probably not the right situation. But in a different scenario, maybe that would have made sense for somebody coming up and down that. But yeah.
And had they been there before, they might have ribboned out a little path, and there might have been a good little trail. But
yeah. But you did a lot of things right. That's what I just thought that was just such an excellent kind of hour and a half tutorial right there. Like I said, don't ask me. The answer is no. I'm not interested ever. But I'm glad you did it.
Yeah, I'm glad I did it, and I can say I did it once. And like I said, there's part of me that pulls and says I want to go back. I want to go back and experience, more of it, of the hunt, not those conditions necessarily. But then again, it's so far. You can't even, in Idaho, in Montana, in Wyoming, we've shot elk 4 or 5 miles back in. It's like, yeah, it's no big deal. We'll put it on our backs. We'll make 2 trips and we get it out of there. It was 7 hours from the kill site to our camp, and it wasn't that far to where we ended up packing it out. It still took us probably 7 hours, but it was a shorter distance. But it's just, there's nothing close. You can't get close to access points to where you're most likely going to kill something. And it's not appealing. There's just nothing about it. Even if you like to suffer, even if you like to put yourself to the test, it was just like, I can probably find a better place to suffer.
Yeah. Well, that was your first Roosevelt. Is that true? You had to go to Alaska to do that?
Yeah, I've hunted twice in Oregon for them and had multiple chances. Just things didn't work out. I've actually had 2 shots and missed both of them due to deflection and thick vegetation. But went up there and got it done on opening day. It was like easy hunting.
Yeah.
The hunting was easy. The packing and the rest of it.
Well, no, it was amazing. I mean, just, we haven't even talked about that, but just the calling sequence and the shot and bringing them in close and being persistent. I mean, we kind of, no pressure, but kind of come to expect that from you. But yeah, but that country up there is, the place and time to run around is in August chasing blacktail up there. Is kind of, you've done that. I know you've been up there later in the year too. You've had your supper fests up there in Alaska.
Oh,
I haven't talked to you about it, but I've talked to another person that I know. Yeah.
Yeah. Our buddy Tyler.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And bringing up Tyler, he's like Corey, he's this long, lean, mountain moving machine. And the first time we went up there to film blacktails, the guy we went with, Jim Bachtel, he says, well, we're only gaining 1,400 vertical, but it's going to take 8 hours. And
Tyler should tell you everything you need to know.
Yeah, Tyler and I look at each other, and I'm like, Tyler, 8 hours. I can't think of any 1,400 foot vertical hike that's going to take 8 hours. He's like, nah. And we kind of looked at Jim like, he's about 7, 8 years older than me. Maybe that's why. Well, plane drops us off. We reorganize our gear, lighten up for what we're going to attack the mountain with. And 8 hours later, we kind of punched through the Alpine or into the Alpine and did that. And then the next time we went up there, Tyler was going to do it with his bow, and we had a PhD person, Dr. Sophie Gilbert, with us. We're doing a film, and the first day we got there, it was so much like Corey's story. We get there, and there it is, every beautiful vista. It still took 8 hours the second time. We get there, next day, Sophie shoots a nice buck, Jim shoots a nice buck, and we saw this buck that was so big. And Jim has, he's got the muzzleloader world record, blah, blah, blah. He's like, I think that's the archery world record buck there. Well, Tyler's all excited. He's like, I'm going to get this thing. It rained so hard for the next 4 days, you could not see across the Alpine meadow. And so Tyler is just determined he's going to find this buck, and he never does. And I'm sure, if, like Corey said, if he would have been trying to archery hunt after the first day, you're just wasting your time. And I've been up there on those islands in October and did a brown bear hunt, and it rained 11 inches in 6 days. I mean, it was just torrential. The one thing that I've brought from my adventures to Alaska, and this is probably me trying to translate how or maybe worries or concerns I'd have, is, here in the lower 48, and you kind of touched on this, John, that I think people are like, well, if things really get bad, the fertilizer hits the ventilator, I'll hit my button and someone will come get me. That is not happening. Even the terrain where we Sitka blacktail hunt just west of where Corey was, it's not nearly as high as where he was. But if it's sucked in, they aren't coming to get you. There's no place to land. There's even with a helicopter, okay, you're augured into those 300-foot Sitka spruce. How they going to get you? And usually the weather is so terrible. And so anyone going to try that, whether it's a hunt like Corey did or even just that part of the world, and I'm sure the Alaska guys are fully versed in this, but don't think that that's your emergency plan. I think Corey and Donnie showed that using the John Barklow theory that knowledge weighs nothing is what gets you out of those situations and gets you through them in a safe manner, but also in a confident manner that you're not going to panic, you're not going to do something stupid. When I was watching that weather and I'm watching Donnie, how sick he is, I'm like, fortunately I knew the outcome, but I'm like, if you're laying there in that tent like that and you have that type of problem, there's really not an extraction measure when it's blowing and it's raining that hard. And so that's probably the one thing I hope that people who watch that and have this ambitious kind of Evel Knievel spirit in them, all right, there's not the safety net there that you think there is if you are, in the Gallatin Range of Montana, or you're in the Frank Church of Idaho, or, wherever you might go. But when Corey drew the tag, I was like, I'm glad it's you and not me, because I've only hauled those little Sitka blacktail off those mountains, and I don't need any more part of what that looks like. So
I'm surprised at the number of people that ask me if, like, a satellite communication device like an InReach or a Zoleo or something like that is worth it, and do I use that? And so you talk about the situation Donnie was in, right? I mean, the air crews, even if they want to come get you, there's conditions they can't. Like, it's dangerous for them, if not more than you. So you really are completely isolated and kind of on your own and self-sufficient. But how many places in Montana, Idaho, out west here where we live, you could be driving down a major freeway and lose cell service. and people are unaware of that, right? And so, let alone in a canyon, in some hellhole, where you kill an elk, and then something happens. And I'm like, listen, if you can have those, that is what I call risk mitigation. Like, we didn't even talk about that, Corey, but obviously you guys were, communicating with each other. It looked like, I'm sure if you had, those devices, you could communicate with loved ones. You could communicate with the float plane base. Like, that is part of the risk mitigation, right? Your experience, your knowledge, your gear, like all of that starts to go in. But it's like, man, like that is cheap insurance for somebody to purchase, even in the lower 48. If you're coming out, haven't been back east in a long time, and don't plan to anytime soon. But if you're out here, like, it can surprise people who are uninitiated. It's like, man, that is a cheap piece of insurance that can really, help keep you safe, help keep loved ones from worrying about you. I mean, I put my poor wife through hell over the years before those things existed, just wandering off into the mountains, and generally knowing where I'm going, but having no idea what is actually happening. But yeah, you are committed. You really are. You start going into those areas, you really are committed, and weather. Which you have all the time up there, not so much as down here, but it just grounds everything. Even if they want to come get you, they don't have an option.
Well, on the day we flew out, we had a 2-hour window that they could come in, and they radioed and said, if you can tell us you'll be at the lake in an hour and a half, we'll head that way and come get you. But we have to leave by this time. And we flew back, and the mountain pass we were trying to go through was fogged in, and we had to turn back and basically hit the bank and fly along the coast the whole way back because the cloud floor was too low and we couldn't make it over. And after that, so the next day when we flew out on the commercial airlines, they shut the commercial airlines down because it was too windy and too rainy to fly out. So they couldn't have got back in for 6 more days to that island. There wasn't a break for 6 days after they picked us up in that 2-hour window. And, you have to be prepared for that you might, it might come down to the last day of your hunt and you've got to get picked up and make your flight back at the commercial airport. You might not get picked up for 6 more days. So you can't run out of food. You've got to think about that. You've got to think about all of those things, worst case, because a lot of times worst case is what you're left with.
Yeah. Well, the worst case up there is oftentimes par for the course. Unfortunately. Yeah. I think you should just keep talking because you have, not that I wasn't convinced otherwise, but I just don't need to go up there and do that again anytime soon. I mean, I love Alaska. I'll go, mountain goat hunt or caribou or something like that. But yeah, no, it's a special place, but it brings on a lot of challenges that you just don't deal with any other place down here in the lower 48, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Well, Corey, I think now, if anyone previously doubted as we relayed this story and thought that you were just trying to scare them off so you have better draw odds, I think John has served as confirmation that this is not to be taken with, for the faint of heart shall not apply. I'm glad you guys made it out okay. I'm glad nobody got really hurt because even some of the most experienced people I know have ended up in some bad situations in Alaska. Alaska can just hand you things that even the best sometimes are going to have to tough out some injury or illness or just weather or whatever. So,
well, in some regard, I mean, honestly, from everything you've said, I mean, literally the trip, for all intents and purposes, couldn't have gone any better.
Yeah.
You went up there, you killed a beautiful bull. You had some adventure. You got out just in time, not only in the float plane, but on the commercial plane. Like, really, I mean, for an Alaska adventure, it doesn't get much easier, so to speak. Than that. No, it's true though. I mean,
it all fit on the timeline. I mean, that's just
it all fit on the timeline.
We hit all the points,
yep.
And yeah.
No,
and I mean, looking back, and I know there's people that have hunted there before or that live up there that are like, oh, they're just dramatizing this. And to a degree, yeah, there's some dramatizing going on, but every one of those points that we talked about and that John mentioned, I mean, we were 1 degree away from disaster in every one of those senses. And so, it's easy to say, well, yeah, it's not that bad. I've done that before. Even down here, I've been in some horrible rainstorms and blizzards and things, but it breaks down here. You get a break after a couple days. Up there, there's just no break. It's relentless. It's day after day after day. And that's hard mentally to prepare for. And then, you take Donnie. I'm the biggest baby when I'm sick. I'm in a 72 degree home with people waiting on me hand and foot, and all the food I could want and all the medicine and access to doctors and everything with just a common cold. And I'm still the biggest baby. You think about being sick, and Donnie, I mean, he was 2 weeks, literally 14 days from his positive COVID test. I mean, he had to wait 14 days to travel. And it was on the day that we traveled that he could travel. He had that. So we didn't know, is he having a reaction to COVID? And, there's a lot of unknown and uncertainty there. So just the mental aspect of being stuck in a tent and knowing that your hunting partners are out in a torrential downpour packing elk meat in dangerous situations. I mean, just the mental stress that adds to something like that. Then to find out Donnie passes 3 kidney stones, the last day we're up there. And that's what we finally realized was causing.
The end? You kept this till the end to tell me? Oh my God.
So he's laying in the tent with, for 3 days with these kidney stones trying to make their way through him. And that's what was causing the sweating and the fever and the chills and all of that. So, I mean, just the mental toughness. Donnie didn't pack out any elk meat. But I think he endured probably mentally more than John and I could imagine for what he went through.
And he proved himself to be, I mean, such a great partner. I know he's a great friend, but he proved himself to be such a great partner out there that, I mean, he's laying there in a tent by himself, passing kidney stones, but he doesn't know that, catching rainwater off the top of the rain fly. Self-filming himself for whatever reason. I wouldn't have been that calm. I mean, the things I would have filmed, you couldn't have shown to the general public. But and he's just a trooper. Trooper. Yeah, the whole time.
Yeah, I think in his mind he was contributing dad jokes on video. That's he couldn't contribute to packing, so he's I'm gonna tell some dad jokes here in this miserable state that I'm in. But yeah, it's and John, you can't say enough about John. Just to be able to capture all that and never complain. I mean, he's out there to film. He's not there to put himself in dangerous situations with crampons and 100 pounds of meat on his back, but he does it, and he's positive attitude is such a big thing, and we try. I think for the most part, we kept a great attitude, and we made it as fun as possible. And John didn't deter from that one bit. It was always, hey, wherever you want to go, yeah, just let me know. Let's go that direction. Let's try that, and never complained. So yeah, that can't be overstated enough. Just having good partners that you can rely on and be confident in them. You're confident in your gear. You're confident in your abilities to survive in those conditions, and then confident in your partners that they're not going to be a weight. They're going to be lifting you up the whole time.
Well, I mean, I've been writing something about partners recently, and I mean, the truth is, and especially in environments like that, and even in the environments we run around in regularly, where grizzly bears and wolves and stuff are running around, but you have to trust those people with your lives. And it can sound dramatic until you're in a situation like that, and then it's true, So I don't think that can be overstated. Actually, strong partnerships, and if anything, that film showed me that as well. I don't know the camera guy. It seemed like he when he filmed himself a couple times, he was thinking some things that I wished he'd have said on camera, but I'm sure they'd have had to been bleeped. But I'm like, oh, that guy's a trooper, man. That guy's a trooper. If I had a subtitle of what he's thinking right now, I'd be laughing. But yeah.
Well, Corey, you might want to watch out. People are going to be getting a hold of you and say, "Hey, who's this John Abernathy guy? Can I hire him away from Corey?"
Nope. He's been with me since we were both very inexperienced in a lot of ways. So he's a great friend, and I'm very fortunate to have him tagging along on most of our adventures.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Well, John, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I was really excited that you would be you'd in your busy calendar you could find time with all the other stuff you're producing for your Knowledge of Storms platform. The audience gets a ton out of this, and Corey, I think that video. I was telling Corey before we turned on the mics, I watched it again last night in full detail, and it's probably the most epic adventure elk hunt I think I've ever watched. And at first I thought an hour and 24 minutes. Come on. No, it needed every hour and 24 minutes to tell the depth of the story. And I think people who've been there and done it and dealt with Alaska probably get more out of it than folks who haven't.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I saw the same thing. I'm like, an hour and 24 minutes. What are they going to talk about? And I looked down at the counter and it said 56 minutes. And I was like, that went by so fast. Like, I was just like, I was totally enthralled by the whole thing. Like I said, sweating it the whole time, but also
and that's
feeling
just,
pretty lucky.
It's John told me when he first laid it out, he's like, I'm like at 2 hours, and obviously we can cut some stuff away, but what don't you want to tell? I'm like, we have to tell the whole story. Like we'll let the cards fall where they are on the timeline. And that's been the comment we've got is I could have watched that for 3 hours. I was on the edge of my seat. Like I needed to go and have a drink afterwards because I was so tight and so stressed from just sitting there watching that. And that's what, I think that's what you want to do. You want to bring people with you in those kind of films so that they feel like they're right there. And for John to be able to do that in those conditions is just a testament to his skill set and his talent.
Yeah. By the way, it's also the first time I've ever heard a Roosevelt elk bugle was on film, because I thought you were crazy. I'm like, yeah, I bet they kind of bugle, but they're not going to respond to bugles. I've never heard one bugle. I've never hunted them in the, that early in the year, but that footage of the elk was pretty awesome. That bull coming in and that interaction was pretty cool. Just raking that moss and stuff, and that was pretty epic. That
had we shot him the first call in, when he first came in, if he'd have just came straight in and we shot him, it wouldn't have been near the film. But the way he came in for 40 minutes and just stood there in front of us and put on a rut show, that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, very cool.
Well, John, thanks so much. We really appreciate it. Hope we can lean on you more. But I also hope everybody will go out to your platforms. I've been following along. In fact, I called you about a month or so ago. I'm like, John, what the hell are you doing here? This is good stuff. Don't be giving this stuff away. But people who know John Barklow know that he's all about sharing knowledge and teaching, and probably as unselfish of a guy as you're ever going to meet. And we're thankful that you take time to share that knowledge with our audience and with us. So appreciate it, John.
Oh, it's always so much fun talking to you guys. I appreciate you asking me to come on and talk again.
Yeah, we'll put a link to the website in the notes and make sure people can find it. But it's knowledgefromstorms.com.
Yep, that's it.
All together. So,
and if you sign up, I've been pushing out a monthly newsletter, and there's a trip planning form they can get there, all that stuff. So, yeah, a lot of good stuff there. More to come.
Awesome. John, thank you.
Thanks, John. Corey, have a great day.
You too. Thanks for listening, everyone.